How are you doing? I'm Joe Dallas. This podcast is Christians in a Cancel Culture, and I thank you for joining me. On this podcast, we talk a lot about our role and our challenges. We talk about our role. We are ambassadors for Christ. We are ministers of reconciliation. We are salt. We are light. That's our role as believers in this world. And the challenge is to communicate. If we're going to fulfill our role, we have to be able to preach the gospel. We have to be able to teach the word of God. We have to be able to communicate if we're going to fulfill those roles. And part of the challenge now is that we exist in a culture that is largely trying to silence the Christian voice on some key issues. On this podcast, we address 5 of those key issues: abortion, racism, transgender, homosexuality, and progressive Christianity. Every week, we try to cover one of those topics, a different topic each week, but we're going to veer off that course for the next 5 weeks because there is something that has come up that really does require some special focus. And that is the trend towards banning what is called conversion therapy. Because this is such an egregious action that's being taken internationally, and because it is so relevant to the modern church, we really felt that it warranted us taking 5 separate parts, 5 separate sections to address this. So today and then for the following 4 weeks, we're going to be looking at conversion therapy bans, what they are and why they matter. That is, again, the international trend towards criminalizing the biblical view on human sexuality. You may not know it, but as of today, as we speak, there are 24 states in the U.S., 2 U.S. territories, and 100 different counties and cities that already have on the books bans against what is called conversion therapy. Internationally, 14 countries have these kinds of bans on the books, the most recent being our neighbor Canada. And now, what exactly is it that these laws are banning? Well, right off the bat, let's clarify that the term conversion therapy is a pejorative. Okay, kind of like the term religious right. You've probably heard that, haven't you? If somebody is deemed to be part of the religious right, it means that they are a Christian who wants a theocracy, who wants to impose Christianity on everyone and enact the death penalty for sinners and basically establish this sort of Orwellian Christian utopia. And that's a pejorative that gets slammed on any Christian who is politically involved. So it is with the term conversion therapy. It's a pejorative that has a sinister tone like the religious right does. And basically, it's a term applied to anybody who offers counsel or advice or mentoring to someone who's struggling against their homosexuality and wants to pursue the biblical course for people who are dealing with any sin in their life. Well, when people say, oh, that's conversion therapy, they basically say, oh, you are one of those people who is going to try to humiliate homosexual people, tell them they're the worst kind of sinners and coerce them, or make them a lot of claims that if they follow your formula, they'll come out completely straight, and you're going to do them a lot of psychological damage. Now, right off the bat, nobody uses that term. At least nobody uses that term who does what they call conversion therapy. A lot of people use that term, but just like with the term religious right, Christians who are politically involved, Christians who are involved in the system, don't call themselves the religious right. Those of us who offer ministry or counsel or therapy to people struggling with homosexuality, we certainly don't call ourselves conversion therapists. Look it up yourself. Nobody who is accused of doing this actually uses that term. But in these bans, conversion therapy is described as or defined as any kind of counsel, advice, or ministry designed to change sexual orientation. That is, to change someone's homosexual feelings into heterosexual feelings. Well, now again, check this out yourself. Go online, look up any of the ministries who offer help to people struggling with homosexuality. You will not see any of them advertising that they convert people's sexual feelings from gay to straight. You will find several ministries, my own included, that do clarify that we help people deal with their homosexual feelings in a biblical way, and to whatever extent they experience those homosexual temptations. We do offer biblically based guidance on how to deal with those temptations, but that's a far cry from saying we advertise that we can turn gay people into straight people. So first of all, the term is applied to anyone who offers what is called counseling or therapy designed to change sexual orientation, or any counseling or ministry or mentoring or therapy to help someone change their homosexual behavior. Now, that might surprise you. Usually when people talk about conversion therapy, people who hear that think that they are only talking about therapy aimed at changing somebody's feelings. That's not true. These bans against conversion therapy ban any kind of counseling or ministry that helps people change their behavior. If they are involved in homosexual behavior and they want counseling to help abstain from that behavior, these bans would criminalize that kind of counseling. If they are involved in what you would call transgender behavior, they are cross-dressing or they are openly identifying as a female when they were born male, or as a male when they were born female, and they reach a point where they realize, hey, that's not really who God meant me to be. Will you help me to stop this behavior? These bans would criminalize that kind of counseling, or even counseling that is set to inform someone of the biblical position on homosexuality or transgender. All of those forms of counseling or ministry would be criminalized, are criminalized, in fact, under these bans on conversion therapy. Now, notice again, these are bans on voluntary counseling. That is, counseling that people ask for. I would certainly agree nobody should coerce anybody into counseling. I don't believe that anybody should be manipulated or threatened or forced to undergo counseling that they don't want. But just for example, let me tell you a very typical client that I have, a married Christian man who feels homosexual temptations, and at times he has been acting on those temptations. Maybe he's looking at gay porn, maybe he's even going out and establishing sexual contacts with other men, and he realizes this is wrong. This is an area of weakness in my life. I don't want to give in to this. Will you help me to stop doing this? Hey, if I was living in a state or a nation where conversion therapy was banned, I would have to say, no, I can't do that. That's illegal. I literally could not help a man stay true to his marriage vows because I would be encouraging him to abstain from homosexual behavior. My gosh, I had my own crisis of faith when I was 29 years old back in 1984. I'm 67 now. I'll save you the math. At that time, I sought counseling. I'd been involved in homosexuality. I no longer wanted to be involved in homosexuality. I wanted to get some ideas on how I could manage my feelings, deal with my temptations, and so forth. I think I had the right to seek out that kind of counsel. I got that kind of counsel. And now all these years later, I've been married for 34 years. I have 2 sons. I have what I believe is a very healthy and a very good marriage, none of which would have happened if that kind of counsel had been denied me. Or perhaps it would have happened, but I would have been denied help in that process. That would be illegal. And that is exactly why bans on conversion therapy are wrong. That is exactly why bans on conversion therapy set a precedent which is dangerous. These bans are wrong because they override freedom of choice, and they override freedom of religion. And they set a dangerous precedent because this action of the government stepping in and telling the church what it may or may not say about homosexuality, come on, don't kid yourself. It's not going to stop on the homosexual issue. If we allow a precedent to be set by which the government tells the church what we may or may not teach, then whatever else we teach which is deemed offensive, including the fact that there is only one way to the Father, that there is such a thing as hell for those who do not receive the gift of salvation through Christ, and that humanity is inherently sinful, that we are born sinners. Hey, those are not exactly compliments, are they? They're not even very nice things to say, but they are gospel truths. Hey, if we allow the government to tell us what we may or may not say, and to tell us that if something we say is offensive, they may silence us, it's not going to stop on the sexuality issue, as serious as that is. It will extend itself to other areas of church life and doctrine as well. That's why we need to be talking about this. So in this 5-part series, I hope to prove both the points I made, that bans on conversion therapy are wrong and that they set a very dangerous precedent. We'll do that in 5 parts. Today, we're going to talk about part 1. I call it Curing Gays, ? And that's a little bit about the history and the treatment of homosexuality. Then I'd like to talk about Exodus International. In part 2, I'm going to pose the question, did Exodus blow it? Exodus International being an organization very well known for offering what is now called, rather dismissively, conversion therapy. We'll take 2 episodes to discuss Exodus, and then in episode or part 4, we'll be talking about the beginning of the bans. And then finally, we'll end this series with an entire part dedicated to talking about how to respond. I'm going to simply bring up all of the major objections to what is called conversion therapy, and I'm going to offer you some very plain, concise talking point answers that you can use. So for today, let's talk about curing gays, ? Are we curing gays? Is that what this is all about? Let's frame it by acknowledging 2 separate groups. They've always existed, they have the right to exist, and they have the right to make their own decisions. There are those who realize they are attracted to the same sex. They are thereby homosexual, and they embrace that. They realize it, and they reach a point of saying, okay, I'm good with this. I'm gay, or I'm lesbian, or if we talk in today's terms, I'm transgender or bisexual or whatever, different terms, labels being applied either to homosexuality or transgenderism. That's who I am. I'm comfortable with it, and I wish to live it out. I'm okay with it. Okay, that's one group. But there is another group, and that's those who not only realized that they were attracted to the same sex, but they also reached a point of realizing, I'm not okay with this. I don't think this is right. I don't think this is what I was meant to be. I want to pursue other options. I, at the very least, do not want to be acting on these feelings, and I would like some help in dealing with these feelings according to a traditional, orthodox, biblical perspective. People in that position obviously want to immediately change their behavior, and they also want to at least explore to whatever extent their feelings may change as well. Now, that first group has the right to live their choice out, don't they? Absolutely, they do. God created us with free will. Gay and lesbian people, transgender people, bisexual people, asexual people have every right to live their lives out as they see fit. No one has the right to tell them that they may not do that. But the second group has the right to live their lives out as well and to live their choice out as well. They have the right to make a decision to abstain from that behavior and to pursue a different way of living, and if possible, even a different way of responding. Both of these groups have the right to speak and teach according to their own worldview. Neither group has the right to deny the other group those basic rights. That's something we were promised back in 2015 when the U.S. Supreme Court passed its decision basically striking down state bans on same-sex marriage. And in that Supreme Court decision, the majority opinion wrote, and I'm quoting here, in explaining its decision to basically legitimize gay marriage in America, the majority of the justices also said this: finally, it must be emphasized that religions and those who adhere to religious doctrines may continue to advocate with utmost sincere conviction that, by divine precepts, same-sex marriage should not be condoned. The First Amendment ensures that religious organizations and persons are given proper protection as they seek to teach the principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faiths, and to their own deep aspirations to continue the family structure they have long revered. End quote. That's what we were promised. And that, again, is why we are against conversion therapy bans. Those bans fly in the face of what we have been promised. Now, I mentioned these 2 groups. Well, both of them have always existed, and they've always existed because homosexuality has always existed. It is described in the Old Testament. It is cited in ancient writings. It is a fact of human sexuality. The biblical perspective on homosexuality is that it is one of many symptoms of what we call the sin nature, our fallen nature. Now, some symptoms of the sin nature that is, our sinful nature inherited from our father Adam, who basically acquired a sin nature when he sinned. He was born perfect and in perfect union with God. When he sinned, he broke that union and thereby acquired a sin nature, passed on that sin nature to all of the rest of us. There are some aspects of that sin nature that are common to all of us. We can all relate to the temptation to lie, to be selfish, to steal, to hurt someone. We can all relate to those. There are sinful tendencies that are universal, and there are some that are uncommon, more unique to individuals. Homosexuality is one of them. That is a temptation experienced only by a minority of the population. Either way, they are all fruit from the same tree. In the garden, when Adam and Eve fell, God said to them, in essence, from here on out, the human experience is going to contain things that I never intended. So we believe that there is such a thing as created intent. We have a creator who created us with intentions, and we believe that there are many behaviors and tendencies that fall short of those intentions, and that is the definition of sin. Homosexuality being one of many sins. Now, throughout history, different cultures have, of course, had different perspectives on homosexuality. Some cultures have been affirming. This is fine. This is good. We celebrate it. Some have been tolerant. Well, it's okay, whatever. Some have been prohibitive. Now, traditionally, Western culture, particularly the U.S., has had a prohibitive stance towards homosexuality until about the past 50 years. And because the culture has traditionally held a prohibitive position, homosexual behavior traditionally in the U.S. up until about 50 years ago was illegal in most states. It was considered abnormal. It was culturally frowned on. And because of that, it kind of muddied the water when it came to that second group saying, I'm dissatisfied. I don't want to embrace this in my life, because the question became, well, why? Now, back in 1984, when I repented of homosexuality, it wasn't because of anything the culture said. I didn't really care what the culture said. I did my own thing, and nobody was going to tell me what to do. I had my own crisis of faith and realized this is not right, and I don't want to pursue it anymore. But yes, when the whole culture was telling homosexual people, you're freaks, you're queers, you're disgusting, when they could be arrested just for being seen in a gay bar, much less touching somebody in a gay bar, when a homosexual act could get them thrown into prison, when they could be forced into psychiatric treatment against their will, when they could be blackmailed, when they could be fired, when they could be ostracized from the community. Well, oftentimes those were the motivations for them seeking help or seeking some kind of treatment. And when they did seek help, what were they told? Well, depends on when they were seeking help. There was a time when the basic approach towards treating homosexuality was, that's evil, that's degenerate, that's terrible. You must stop doing it. You'll be punished if you do that. Sometimes the help would come in the form of somebody saying, well, you have a form of insanity, a form of depravity. You need shock therapy, or you need some vile form of aversion therapy. And in some cases, hate to even mention it, but people were given lobotomies for this. This is a fascinating book by Dr. Ronald Baer. It's called Homosexuality and American Psychiatry, The Politics of Diagnosis. Now, it's got a detailed history of the treatment of psychiatric care for homosexual people throughout history, particularly in the U.S. And it's both a good, enlightening account of the different forms of treatment, some terrible, some okay, and some good, for homosexuality. It also gives a very detailed account of the famous 1973 decision made by the American Psychiatric Association to normalize homosexuality. So again, fascinating read that you can pick up. You can go through Amazon.com, get a copy of that if you'd like to know more about the history of the treatment of homosexuality. Well, that rather limited and highly judgmental approach to treating homosexuality segued into a gentler approach when Freud and Freudian thought and the whole psychoanalytic school of therapy began approaching this by saying, well, homosexuality represents something that has gone wrong in the soul. something which has gone wrong developmentally. And if we can talk about that, if we can analyze that, if we can work through that, that will effectively then address the problem of homosexuality. In fact, Freud wrote a famous letter to the mother of a homosexual. This woman had written to Freud saying, "Please help my son, he's homosexual. Can you help him?" And Freud wrote back to her saying, and I'll paraphrase here, he said basically, "Well, whether or not I can help your son largely depends, of course, on whether or not he wants help." And Freud was quick to say, "Look, many very worthwhile people have been homosexual. It is neither a vice nor is it a virtue." That was the way he framed it. He said, "I believe it represents a stunting of psychosexual development. And sometimes," he said, "sometimes in psychoanalysis, we can," and I'll quote him here, "revive the blighted germinations that are present in every homosexual." So Freud seemed to believe that all people had the germinations or the capacity for heterosexual response. I'm not saying I agree with that necessarily, and I'm certainly not saying I'm Freudian. I am not. I'm only saying that that was his basic take on it. The point is, this was when psychiatry started speaking to the soul of the homosexual person and saying, okay, you're not a freak and you're not insane and you're not a devilish person. Let's talk about what may have contributed to this. And that, of course, for many homosexual people, that alone offered a tremendous amount of relief. Then came the gay rights movement in 1969, especially. That was a watershed moment, the Stonewall riots, the uprising, and that was when gay rights began to develop a particular identity, saying we demand equal and fair treatment. And then the gay rights movement began to target the American Psychiatric Association because tactically they realized if we can persuade the mental health organization to normalize homosexuality, that will go a long ways towards persuading the culture, which is largely anti-homosexual, was at the time, that homosexuality is normal. And they successfully, through a series of efforts and even invasions of the conventions of the American Psychiatric Association, persuaded the APA to revise its diagnostic status of homosexuality. Now, in my book, The Gay Gospel, I do clarify how this process happened, and if you'd like a more detailed account of the events leading up to 1973 and then the 1973 decision and its ramification, you can order that book right here on my website, 𝗤𝗢𝗟𝗏.com, The Gay Gospel. At that time, then, the treatment of homosexuality shifted from treating homosexuality itself to treating what was then classified as ego-dystonic homosexuality. That was a way of the American Psychiatric Association basically saying, okay, we no longer consider homosexuality to be an illness. We no longer consider it to be abnormal. If you're homosexual, we don't believe you need treatment. But if you are homosexual and you yourself are unsatisfied with it, if that is dystonic rather than systonic with your self-view and with your worldview, then you should get treatment. And that's, again, when treatment shifted from treating homosexuality itself to treating ego-dystonic homosexuality. Now, in my first book, Desires and Conflict, I pointed out a number of studies that had been done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that purported a fairly high success rate among people who were treating homosexuals who were motivated because their homosexuality was ego-dystonic. In all fairness, most of these studies involved self-reporting. And of course, I believe any study that involves self-reporting should be viewed with a certain amount of caution. I myself would not base an argument entirely on what had happened in my office with my clients, because for goodness sakes, I can't prove that one way or another. And anybody can say, oh, I've treated 1,000 homosexual people and 90% of them came out cured. I mean, that's not verifiable. Still, the studies were encouraging, and I thought they were illuminating in a lot of ways. But there was still a problem for the Christian, because there have always been Christians who wrestle with homosexuality. By the way, there have always been Christians who at one time were involved in homosexuality. Most Christians never have been, but good grief, as long ago as when Paul wrote to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10, he said, don't kid yourselves. There are behaviors that exclude people from the kingdom. And he said homosexuality is one of them. And then he said, and such were some of you. Some of you in the church were at one time involved in homosexuality. So there have always been people within the church who have been impacted by this sin. And there have always been believers who have wrestled with homosexual temptations and said, where can I go for help? How do I deal with this? Well, if they were looking for help in the Mental Health Association, of course, they would have to come up with the bucks to pay for it. And in some cases, that wasn't an option. And largely, the philosophical base of secular therapists was not the same as it was for the Bible-believing Christians. So oftentimes, the Bible-believing Christian who had this dilemma, I'm attracted to the same sex, but I know this is not God's will. I would like some help, but I don't know who to talk to. And the mental health professional is coming from a psychiatric worldview, but not from a biblically based worldview. So if I talk to him, I'm going to have to talk outside the context of my faith. Where was the church in all this? Well, part of me wants to say, don't get me started, but I will at least say this much. The church has always been available to repentant homosexuals. But the church has certainly not always acknowledged repentant homosexuals. And those are two different things. I can testify to this firsthand. Traditionally, if somebody came into the church who was struggling with this temptation, they would hear from the pulpit, if the subject came up, condemnation of homosexuality. That's good and that's biblical. They would often hear a certain contempt expressed for homosexuals that was not expressed for people committing other sins. That is not good. And rarely would they hear anything encouraging them to overcome this. Rarely would they hear anything giving them some tools with which to deal with it. And so that left a void, a big void. That has traditionally left a lot of people within the body of Christ feeling like, hey, I know it would be a sin if I gave in to these feelings, but what do I do with these feelings? Can I confess them to anyone? Can I find anyone who has overcome them? Can I find anyone who will not consider me a freak and a monster if I admit that this temptation is a part of my life, or God forbid that I've even been involved in this sin? Is there any place for me to go? Well, that's where the void was. And by the early to mid 1970s, an organization would develop which would fill that void. In our next part of this 5-part series, I want to take some time to talk about that organization, Exodus International. I want to talk about how and why Exodus was developed. I want to talk about what it did right. I want to talk about criticisms of it. I want to talk about my own feelings about those criticisms. And then I want to talk about the demise of Exodus International, how it fell, why it fell, and what we can learn from that. We'll start that next week. For today, let's just offer a few closing thoughts. As I said, there have always been both groups. Both groups should be respected. No, I don't agree with anybody who says I embrace homosexuality. I think it's right. I think it's moral. I think this is the way God made me. No, I do not agree. But I can respect their right to live their life as they see fit. I would only ask that they would respect the rights of others to live their lives as they see fit as well. Now, when people have sought help, when people have struggled against their homosexuality, have they been offered help that turned out to be no help at all? Well, unfortunately, that's true. Some of the treatment offered to homosexual people was, everything. I mean, it ranged from the barbaric to the silly to the not helpful at all, and at times to the very helpful. I mean, that's true. But hey, come on. The same could be said of people who sought help for depression. In some cases, they were offered help that was very sound and reasonable. In some cases, they were thrown in for shock treatment or lobotomy or terrible aversion therapies. That's also been true of people dealing with, things like hysteria or fits of temper. Any number of times, the psychiatric industry has resorted to some very dark or bizarre techniques in dealing with many different conditions, not just limited to homosexuality. Here's the bottom line. If a person sought help because they were struggling with homosexuality and the treatment they got was weird or inappropriate or damaging in some way, the problem is the way they were treated, not the fact that they were treated. And along that line, let's remember that the church has the mandate to preach the gospel and to make disciples. That is, to preach the gospel, to give people clarity as to how to be born again. And once people are born again, they then need the full counsel of God in learning how to live a disciple's life. That includes mentoring, that includes counseling according to Scripture. You cannot make disciples without giving people the full counsel of God. You cannot give people the full counsel of God if you cannot tell them what God has said regarding their relationships, their intimacy needs, their sexual connections, the definition of marriage, family, and normal sexual union. We've got to remain free to teach those principles, and we have to be clear when we teach them. Therefore, we have to resist any efforts to keep us from fulfilling the Great Commission. That's why we're talking about this. Now, if you would like the notes, the outlines for these 5 parts that we're doing in this series, why don't you just email me, joe@joedallas.com. That's pretty simple, joe@joedallas.com. You email me, I'll be glad to send you the outline notes for this series. If you've not yet subscribed to this podcast, won't you do so now? Hit that bell and subscribe to the podcast. Then in the comments, let me know that you subscribe so that I can thank you personally. Please do also check out our Facebook site, where we do a weekly cast called Sound Doctrine Bites. Sound Doctrine Bites. If you have not yet picked up my book that this podcast is based on, Christians in a Cancel Culture, this book was written to equip the average believer to be able to discuss abortion, homosexuality, transgender, racism, and progressive Christianity. Please do pick up a copy of this. You can get it at Amazon.com. And of course, if you want to avail yourself of any of the services that we're offering, you want to maybe talk with me about some issues in your own life, why I'm right there at joedallas.com. I'd be glad to set up an appointment with you or talk to you about doing a seminar at your church or your organization. Well, I'll look forward to continuing this series with you next week. Meanwhile, let's remember the advice Paul gave to Timothy. The servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle to all, apt to teach, patient in meekness, instructing those who oppose themselves, that perhaps God will grant them repentance according to the knowledge of the truth. 2 Timothy 2:24-25. Hey, let's remember, when it comes to the truth, it is not just where you stand, it is also how you stand. Good talking with you. See you next week. God bless.